A billionaire forced his black Maid into a steel dog cage in front of a mansion full of tech elites, filming her humiliation. What they didn't know was that the woman behind those bars had been planning this moment for months. And in less than an hour, the man who caged her would be on his knees begging for mercy he'd never shown anyone. The world had witnessed cruelty before, but never live-streamed with champagne in hand. A woman locked behind bars and degraded in front of 150 wealthy investors, while her captor turned her suffering into a party trick. No one expected what happened next. The video went viral. Her name became a rallying cry, and millions watched as the tables turned in the most brutal way imaginable. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's continue. Amira's hands hit the cold steel bars with a sound like a prison door slamming shut on Leonard's future. The lock clicked behind her. The cage was reinforced, custom-built, the size of a walk-in closet, designed to hold animals, now holding her. She felt the press of metal against her spine, the hum of electronic sensors in the lock, the weight of 150 pairs of eyes on her bruised knees and torn uniform. Above the bars, Leonard Kraus's voice rang out, smooth and triumphant. In this house, even the help can be trained. Let this be a lesson. Loyalty is rewarded. Betrayal is punished. Laughter. Applause. The sound of phones recording. The wealthy elite of the tech world watching a woman caged like an animal. Entertained by her degradation. Sharing it live on social media like it was performance art. Leonard leaned against the cage door, his expensive suit catching the mansion's LED mood lighting, his smile sharp as broken glass. You thought you could expose me, Amira? You thought you were clever. He tapped the bars with his Rolex. This is what happens to people who forget their place. The guests circled closer, their champagne glasses glinting in the artificial light, their faces twisted with curiosity and cruelty. Some were filming. Some were laughing. A venture capitalist in a tailored suit called out, "How long are you keeping her in there, Leonard?" "As long as it takes," Leonard replied. But what they didn't know, what Leonard couldn't see through his arrogance, was that Amira had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. She'd mapped every wire, studied every sensor, befriended every low-level contractor who maintained his precious smart home system. And hidden in the hem of her uniform, pressed against her palm, was a small RFID fob she'd stolen 3 weeks ago. The same fob that controlled every electronic lock in the kennel wing, including the one on her cage, including the ones holding back his trained attack dogs. Leonard Kraus had just locked himself in with the only person who could destroy him. 30 minutes earlier, the Innovation Gala had been a picture of obscene wealth and Silicon Valley power. The sun set over Leonard's hilltop smart mansion like a spotlight on sin, casting golden light across terraces that overlooked the city, past infinity pools and imported sculptures, through glass walls that turned the entire estate into a glowing monument to his empire. The mansion itself rose 3 stories, all voice-activated glass panels and biometric locks, every surface white marble or polished chrome. Every angle designed to remind visitors that Leonard Kraus didn't just own technology, he owned the future itself. Facial recognition cameras tracked every guest. LED lighting shifted based on mood algorithms. Even the champagne was served by staff who'd been instructed to move like ghosts, silent and invisible unless needed. The party was in full swing. By 7 p.m. 150 guests milled about the terraces and main hall, sipping vintage Dom Perignon that cost $2,000 per bottle, nibbling on Ostra caviar, served on mother-of-pearl spoons. Tech moguls, venture capitalists, politicians, a Grammy-winning producer, 2 senators, all of them here to see Leonard's latest innovation and to remind themselves they were part of the elite circle that shaped the world. At the center of it all, like a beating heart of control, sat the kennel wing, a glass-walled facility attached to the main house, climate-controlled and filled with imported Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, $50,000 dogs, trained by former military contractors, each one responding to Leonard's voice commands with mechanical precision. "My behavioral laboratory," Leonard would tell guests, that sharp smile spreading across his tanned face. "These animals represent the future of obedience training, precision conditioning, total control." What he didn't mention was that the kennel also housed soundproof holding cells hidden behind false walls, rooms with restraints and medical equipment, spaces where people, not dogs, had been trained. Leonard Kraus stood now near the kennel entrance, wearing a white Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Amira made in 6 months. At 52, he looked like power personified. Perfectly tanned skin, silver threading his dark hair, an Apple Watch prototype catching the light with every gesture. He owned Kraus Tech, a multi-billion-dollar company that produced wearable biometric devices for military, law enforcement, and corporations. Devices that tracked heart rate, stress levels, emotional states, sold as performance optimization, but designed for surveillance and behavior modification. He also had a reputation for ruthlessness that everyone whispered about, but no one challenged. Employees who questioned him disappeared into legal settlements. Journalists who investigated him faced defamation suits. Activists who protested his government contracts found themselves audited, harassed, silenced. Amira Bello moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, her black uniform perfectly pressed, her hair pulled back tight, her face a careful mask of professional neutrality. At 37, she'd learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to serve the wealthy without provoking their attention, how to survive in spaces that made it clear she didn't belong. She carried a tray of wine glasses, weaving between clusters of guests who didn't bother to lower their voices when she approached. They discussed stock portfolios and acquisition deals, complained about regulations and lazy employees, laughed about layoffs that would devastate communities. Celeste had been working for Leonard Kraus for 6 months under the false name Amira Bennett. 6 months of insults masked as jokes. 6 months of racist comments delivered with smiles. 6 months of watching him treat people like disposable objects, like animals to be trained or discarded. But she'd endured it because she needed to be here. Because Leonard Kraus had destroyed something, someone she loved, and she needed proof before she could make him pay. She'd been a social worker once, years ago, a nonprofit employee at a community center, passionate about helping vulnerable populations, homeless veterans, undocumented immigrants, people the system had abandoned. She'd loved her work, believed she was making a difference, building a safety net for those who had nothing. Then her younger brother, Jamal, had fallen through the cracks. A recovering addict trying to rebuild his life, he'd been approached by a rehabilitation program that promised housing, medical care, and job training, all funded by the Kraus Foundation, Leonard's charitable arm. Jamal had signed up. 2 weeks later, he'd called Amira, terrified, saying the place was more like a prison than a rehab center, that they were testing things on people, that he wanted to leave but they wouldn't let him. Amira had rushed to the facility, demanding to see her brother. They'd turned her away, citing confidentiality agreements. When she'd threatened to call the police, Leonard's lawyers had appeared with cease and desist letters. When she'd contacted journalists, they'd been paid off or threatened into silence. When she'd posted about it online, her accounts were suspended, her reputation destroyed by coordinated smear campaigns calling her a liar, an extortionist, a conspiracy theorist. Jamal had disappeared. No records. No body. No answers. Just gone, like he'd never existed. Amira had spent 2 years investigating Leonard's empire, learning about his behavioral modification trials, his government contracts, his network of private facilities where vulnerable people were detained and used as test subjects for his biometric devices. She discovered that dozens of people had vanished after entering Kraus Foundation programs, people without families to advocate for them, people society had already forgotten. 6 months ago, she'd done something desperate. She'd applied to work as Leonard's maid under a false identity, armed with fake references and a plan for revenge. She needed access to his private files. She needed proof that would hold up in court. She needed justice for Jamal and everyone else Leonard had treated like lab rats. And slowly, methodically, she'd found it. Late-night photography sessions in his home office while he entertained on the yacht. Copied files from his personal servers. Video footage from hidden cameras in the kennel wing showing trembling men and women in cages. Contracts signed under duress. Guards discussing Phase 2 trials and expendable subjects. She'd uploaded it all to an encrypted remote drive, waiting for the perfect moment to go public. Waiting for undeniable proof. Leonard had found out yesterday. She didn't know how. Maybe security cameras she'd missed, maybe a contractor who'd talked. But that morning, he'd called her into his office, closed the door, and smiled that terrible smile. "I know what you've been doing, Amira. Or should I say, Amira Bello?" He'd spoken her real name like a weapon. "And tonight, at my Innovation Gala, you're going to learn what happens to people who forget their place." Now, as she moved through the party with her tray of wine, Amira's hands were steady, but her heart raced. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know what. The answer came at 7:43 p.m. She was serving drinks near the Kennel Wing entrance when one of Leonard's guests, a real estate mogul in a $10,000 suit, gestured wildly while telling a story. His hand caught Amira's tray, sending it tilting. A glass of red wine toppled, splashing across the white dress of the woman beside him. The woman shrieked. The conversation died. Everyone turned to stare. "Oh my God!" The woman gasped, looking down at the spreading crimson stain. "This is Valentino. Custom." "I'm so sorry," Amira said immediately, her voice leveled despite her pounding heart. "Let me get something to clean that. I'll pay for the dry cleaning." "You'll pay?" The woman laughed, shrill and cruel. "Do you have any idea what this cost? You couldn't afford this in a year of scrubbing toilets." Leonard appeared beside them as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. His smile was wide and terrible. "What seems to be the problem?" "Your clumsy help just destroyed my dress," the woman said, her voice dripping with contempt. Leonard looked at Amira, and she saw it in his eyes. Cold, calculated triumph. This was it. This was his moment. The staged accident he'd been planning. The excuse he'd been waiting for. "I see," he said softly. Then his voice rose, carrying across the terrace, through the open glass doors, commanding the attention of all 150 guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" The party quieted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Everyone turned toward them. Amira's stomach dropped. "It seems," Leonard announced, his voice smooth as poisoned honey, "that we have a problem with respect in this house. With understanding boundaries. With knowing one's place." He grabbed Amira's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. "This woman has been stealing from me, spying on me, breaking into my private files, violating confidentiality agreements, attempting industrial espionage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. Recording lights blinked on. Amira opened her mouth to defend herself, to tell them the truth, but Leonard's grip tightened, his nails cutting crescents into her skin, silencing her with pain. "And now," he continued, dragging her across the marble floor toward the Kennel Wing, "she's assaulted one of my guests, destroyed property, shown complete disregard for the generosity I've shown her by giving her employment." They were at the kennel entrance now. Through the glass walls, Amira could see the dogs, 8 of them, massive and alert, their ears pricked forward, sensing the tension. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, were the doors Leonard didn't show guests. The soundproof cells, the restraint chairs, the evidence she'd been documenting for months. The guests formed a half-circle around them, phones raised, already recording, already streaming. Some looked uncomfortable, a few women whispering to each other, a younger tech founder frowning. But most looked entertained. This was what they'd come for, Amira realized with cold clarity. Not just innovation, not just networking. They'd come for a show. Leonard's reputation for cruelty wasn't a secret. It was a feature. People like him didn't just host parties. They staged performances of power. "People like you," Leonard said quietly, his voice dropping so only Amira could hear as he unlocked the steel cage with his wrist console. "Think you can be heroes. Think you can expose people like me, and the world will care. But you're not a hero, Amira. You're just help. And help is replaceable." He shoved her forward. Her knees hit the cage floor, pain shooting up her legs. The steel door swung shut behind her with a hollow clang that echoed through the suddenly silent Kennel Wing. The lock clicked. Electronic. Controlled by Leonard's smart home system. Amira looked up through the bars at Leonard's triumphant face, at the crowd of wealthy spectators recording her humiliation, at the gleaming mansion that represented everything she'd lost and everything she was about to take from him. Her fingers found the hem of her uniform, found the small, hard shape of the RFID fob she'd stolen 3 weeks ago from Marco, the careless IT contractor who'd had one too many beers and left his equipment bag unattended. Leonard stood outside the cage, addressing his guests like a ringmaster. Let this be a lesson. In my house, in my company, in my world, loyalty is rewarded. Betrayal is punished. And no one forgets their place. Applause. Laughter. A champagne cork popping somewhere in the background. Amira's thumb found the activation button on the fob hidden in her palm. She pressed it once. Nothing visible happened. But deep in the mansion's central AI system, Sentinel, a maintenance override engaged. Several kennel doors unlocked simultaneously. The security network interpreted it as a breach. And containment mode activated. Amira looked up at Leonard through the bars, her eyes meeting his, and she smiled. He had just caged the only person who could destroy him. And she was about to show him what happens when you lock up someone who's been planning your downfall for 6 months. But Leonard didn't know who Amira Bello really was. 30 minutes earlier, before the staged accident, Amira had been standing in Leonard's industrial kitchen, all stainless steel and marble countertops that cost more than most people's homes, mentally preparing herself for what was coming. Her hands had been steady as she arranged wine glasses on the tray, her face calm, her breathing controlled. But her mind kept drifting back to who she really was, back to the life Leonard Kraus had destroyed. For years ago, Amira Bello had been a different person entirely. Not a maid, not help. She'd been a social worker at Community First, a nonprofit in the city's south side that helped homeless populations, undocumented immigrants, and people struggling with addiction, the ones society had abandoned, the ones who fell through every crack in the system. She'd loved that work, loved sitting across from veterans who couldn't afford housing, from single mothers fleeing domestic violence, from teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. She believed, truly believed, that she was building a safety net for people who had nothing, that her work mattered, that she could make a difference in a world designed to grind vulnerable people into dust. She'd been good at it, too. Great, even. Her supervisor had called her relentless, someone who wouldn't stop advocating until her clients got what they needed. Housing applications, medical care, legal aid, job training. She'd fought bureaucracies and systems and apathy, and she'd won more often than she'd lost. Then she'd discovered the Rehabilitation and Renewal Center. It had started with a client named Marcus, a homeless veteran with PTSD who'd been living under an overpass for 2 years. Someone had approached him with an offer too good to refuse. Free housing, medical care, 3 meals a day, job training, and a small stipend, all provided by a private facility funded by the Kraus Foundation. Marcus had been cautious, but desperate. He'd signed up. 2 weeks later, Amira had visited the facility for a routine check-in. They'd turned her away at the gate. Confidentiality protocols, the security guard had said, his hand resting casually on his baton. No outside visitors without 72-hour advance notice. Mr. Marcus signed a privacy agreement. Amira had pushed back, citing her legal right as his case worker to verify his welfare. The guard had called his supervisor. The supervisor had called someone else. Eventually, a man in an expensive suit had appeared, one of Leonard's lawyers, with a thick stack of papers proving that Marcus had voluntarily signed away his right to outside contact for the duration of the 90-day intensive program. Something about it had felt wrong. The security was too tight. The contracts too comprehensive. The facility too isolated, surrounded by fences and cameras that seemed designed to keep people in rather than out. Amira had started digging. Late nights after work, she'd researched the Rehabilitation and Renewal Center, cross-referencing public records, foundation filings, and local news reports. What she'd found had made her blood run cold. Over 200 vulnerable people had entered the facility in the past 3 years. Homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, recovering addicts. Very few had completed the program. Even fewer had any contact with family or outside advocates during their stays. And a disturbing number had simply disappeared. No forwarding address, no follow-up records, no traceable trail. Just gone, as if they'd never existed. Amira had filed reports with every agency that would listen: Adult Protective Services, the Department of Health, even the FBI's Human Trafficking Division. She'd contacted journalists, bloggers, anyone with a platform. She'd posted detailed threads on social media, laying out the evidence, naming the Kraus Foundation, demanding investigation. Leonard's response had been swift and devastating. Within 2 weeks, she'd received cease and desist letters from 4 different law firms. Defamation, harassment, breach of confidentiality. threats that promised to bury her in legal fees she could never afford. Her nonprofit's board had called an emergency meeting, terrified of the liability, and accepted her resignation before she'd even offered one. Her social media accounts were suspended for violating community guidelines. Journalists who'd initially shown interest suddenly stopped returning her calls. Then the smear campaign began. Anonymous posts appeared online calling her unstable, attention-seeking, a conspiracy theorist inventing stories to cover her own professional incompetence. Someone leaked a fabricated performance review claiming she'd violated client confidentiality and falsified records. Prospective employers Googled her name and found pages of manufactured lies. Within 6 months, Amira had lost her job, her reputation, her apartment when she couldn't make rent, and her career. No one in the nonprofit sector would touch her, not with Leonard Kraus's legal machine targeting her. But the worst part, the thing that had broken something fundamental inside her, was Jamal, her younger brother. 26 years old, sweet and funny, and trying so hard to rebuild his life after years of addiction had nearly killed him. He'd been clean for 8 months, the longest he'd ever managed, working at a grocery store, attending NA meetings, living in a shared apartment with 2 other guys in recovery. He'd been proud of himself, hopeful. He'd started talking about going back to school, maybe becoming a substance abuse counselor to help others the way people had helped him. Then someone from the Rehabilitation and Renewal Center had approached him outside his NA meeting. Friendly, persuasive, offering the same deal they'd offered Marcus. Housing, medical care, job training, a fresh start in a structured, supportive environment. Jamal had called Amira, excited, asking what she thought. She'd felt ice flood her veins. She'd begged him not to go, tried to explain what she'd discovered about the facility, warned him that it wasn't what it seemed. But by then, she'd already been discredited. Jamal had seen the posts calling her paranoid, unstable, a liar. He'd thought she was projecting her own professional failures onto his opportunity. He'd thought she was being overprotective, treating him like a child instead of a grown man capable of making his own decisions. "I love you, sis," he'd said over the phone, his voice gentle but firm. "But I need to do this. I need to prove I can stand on my own. I'll call you when I'm settled, okay?" That had been the last conversation they'd had. 3 days later, Jamal had entered the Rehabilitation and Renewal Center. 2 weeks after that, he'd called her once, voice tight with fear, whispering that something was wrong, that they were testing things on people, that he wanted to leave but they wouldn't let him, that he needed her to come get him. The call had cut off mid-sentence. Amira had rushed to the facility, demanded to see her brother, threatened to call the police. Leonard's lawyers had materialized again, this time with restraining orders and threats of criminal harassment charges if she didn't leave immediately. Security guards had physically escorted her off the property. When she'd called the police, they'd told her that Jamal was an adult who'd voluntarily entered a private program, and that without evidence of criminal activity, there was nothing they could do. When she'd tried to file a missing persons report, they'd shown her Jamal's signature on documents waiving his right to outside contact during the intensive phase of treatment. Jamal had vanished. No discharge records, no forwarding address, no death certificate, no body, just gone, like Marcus and hundreds of others, as if he'd never existed at all. For months, Amira had been consumed by grief and rage and a guilt so crushing she could barely breathe. She'd failed him. She'd tried to warn him, and he hadn't believed her because she'd already been destroyed by the man who'd taken him. Then the grief had calcified into something harder, something colder. Something that wouldn't let her rest until she'd made Leonard Kraus pay for every person he'd disappeared, every life he'd treated as disposable, every family he'd shattered. She'd spent the next 2 years researching Leonard's empire with obsessive precision. Kraus Tech, the government contracts, the private security firms, the real estate holdings that included isolated facilities in 3 states, the biometric implant trials that were supposed to optimize human performance, but were really about behavior modification and surveillance, devices that could monitor stress levels, emotional states, compliance, turning human beings into data points to be controlled. She discovered rumors whispered in online forums and encrypted chat rooms, stories from former employees, leaked documents, encrypted videos, tales of vulnerable people being used as test subjects for experimental technology, detained in off-the-books facilities, trained, using behavioral conditioning protocols originally designed for military interrogation. People without families to advocate for them. People society had already forgotten. People Leonard could experiment on and discard without consequence. 6 months ago, Amira had made her decision. If the legal system wouldn't stop Leonard, if journalists were too afraid to expose him, if regulators could be bought off with campaign donations and charitable foundations, then she would have to destroy him from the inside. She'd created a false identity, Amira Bennett, complete with fake references from a domestic staffing agency that existed only on paper, a fabricated employment history, and a carefully constructed persona of someone desperate enough to take any job without asking questions. She'd applied to work as Leonard's live-in maid. And somehow, impossibly, she'd been hired. Maybe Leonard's HR department had been sloppy. Maybe they'd been desperate for staff willing to tolerate his cruelty. Maybe Leonard had sensed her desperation and liked it, liked having someone vulnerable and dependent under his control. For 6 months, Amira had cleaned his mansion, served his guests, endured his insults and his guests' casual racism, all while documenting everything. Late at night, while Leonard entertained on his yacht or traveled for business, she'd photograph files in his home office. She'd befriended Marco, the low-level IT contractor who maintained the Sentinel smart home system, plying him with coffee and sympathy until he'd let slip details about the network architecture, the maintenance overrides, the electronic locks in the kennel wing. She'd copied files from Leonard's personal servers using a thumb drive hidden in her cleaning supplies. And she'd discovered that the kennel wing, the gleaming, glass-walled facility Leonard showed off to guests as an elite training ground for his imported guard dogs, had a secret. Behind the dog kennels were soundproof holding cells, rooms with restraints bolted to walls, medical equipment for stands, monitoring devices, and hidden cameras that recorded everything. Amira had accessed those cameras through Marco's stolen admin credentials, watching hours of footage that made her stomach turn. Trembling men and women locked in cells barely larger than the dog cages, electrodes attached to their temples, biometric sensors strapped to their wrists, guards in Kraus Tech uniforms discussing Phase 2 trials and behavioral modification protocols, and non-compliant subjects who needed to be transferred off books. She'd found contracts signed under duress. People promised housing and medical care in exchange for participating in voluntary wellness studies. The legal language so dense and deliberately confusing that vulnerable people with limited education had no idea they were signing away their basic human rights. She'd found audio recordings of Leonard himself discussing test subjects like lab rats, complaining about expendable populations who were difficult to train, ordering guards to clean up liabilities when subjects tried to escape or threatened to report what was happening. And she'd found one recording that had made her collapse to her knees in Leonard's marble-floored office, tears streaming silently down her face. Leonard's voice, cold and clinical. Jamal Bello is a risk. He's been asking too many questions, trying to contact his sister. Handle it quietly. Phase him out of the program. Full disposal protocol. Another voice, one of his security chiefs. Where do you want him? Leonard. The usual. Off the coast. Waited. No trace. Her brother. Murdered. Disposed of like trash because he'd tried to reach out to her, because he'd realized too late that she'd been right, that he was trapped in something monstrous. Amira had uploaded every file, every video, every audio recording to an encrypted remote server, building an airtight case. Months of evidence documenting human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, illegal human experimentation, conspiracy, murder. She'd sent encrypted copies to 3 investigative journalists, 2 human rights organizations, and a federal prosecutor known for taking on powerful defendants, all programmed to automatically release if she failed to check in within 24-hour windows. But she'd wanted more than just legal justice. She'd wanted Leonard to know it was her. Wanted him to feel the same helplessness and terror that Jamal had felt, that Marcus had felt, that hundreds of victims had felt. Wanted the world to see him powerless, exposed, begging. Yesterday morning, Leonard had called her into his office and shut the door. His smile had been terrible. I know what you've been doing, Amira. Or should I say, Amira Bello? Her real name had sounded like a weapon in his mouth. Did you really think my security was that sloppy? That I wouldn't notice someone photographing my files, accessing my servers, stealing admin credentials? Her heart had been pounding, but she'd kept her face neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Kraus." "Of course you do." He'd leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled. "You've been very thorough, very patient, almost admirable, really. But here's what you don't understand. Evidence means nothing without credibility. And you, Amira Bello, have no credibility. You're a disgraced former social worker with a history of making false accusations, a conspiracy theorist who lost her career because she couldn't accept reality. She'd stolen it 3 weeks ago during a system maintenance session, palming it while Marco had been distracted by a malfunctioning camera feed. It was a master override for every electronic lock in the kennel wing, including the one on this cage, and the ones holding Leonard's 8 trained attack dogs. Leonard thought he'd won, thought he'd trapped her, humiliated her, destroyed her credibility in front of 150 witnesses and thousands of livestream viewers. He had no idea that every file she'd gathered had already been sent to journalists, that federal investigators were reviewing evidence right now, that her encrypted uploads had been programmed to go fully public in exactly 90 minutes unless she manually canceled them. He had no idea that his smart home system, his precious Sentinel, designed to give him total control over every aspect of his estate, had vulnerabilities she'd spent months learning to exploit. He had no idea that the woman in the cage had been preparing for this exact moment since the day she'd heard his voice on that recording ordering her brother's murder. Amira's fingers closed around the fob. Through the bars, she watched Leonard bask in the applause of his guests, watched phones recording her from every angle, watched the viral humiliation he'd orchestrated playing out exactly as he'd planned. She thought of Jamal, of Marcus, of the hundreds of people Leonard had used and discarded, of every vulnerable person he'd treated like property, like test subjects, like animals to be trained or destroyed. And she whispered to herself, too quietly for anyone to hear over the crowd's laughter, "Let's see who's really in control." Her thumb found the activation button on the fob and pressed it once. Deep in the mansion's walls, in the server room Leonard had shown off to investors as the future of integrated smart home security, Sentinel's maintenance protocols engaged. Several electronic locks in the kennel wing unlocked simultaneously. The AI system interpreted the unauthorized override as a security breach, and containment mode activated. Steel shutters began lowering over exits. Corridor doors auto-locked. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in pulsing red. The guests' laughter faltered. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Someone asked, "Is this part of the show?" Leonard's face shifted from triumph to irritation as his wrist console buzzed with error messages. And in the cage, Amira smiled. Leonard Kraus stood outside the cage, basking in applause, completely unaware that Amira had been studying every wire, sensor, and server in his house for 6 months. He'd built his entire empire on control, on the belief that human behavior, like any complex system, could be monitored, analyzed, optimized, and ultimately owned. And nowhere was that philosophy more visible than in the mansion that rose around them. His crown jewel, his testament to the future he was engineering. Leonard hadn't been born into wealth. That was the story he told in interviews, the origin myth that made him palatable to the public. Self-made billionaire, son of a middle-class insurance adjuster and a school teacher, scholarship kid who'd coded his first app in his parents' garage at 16. He'd built Kraus Tech from nothing, turned it into a $4.8 billion empire, and done it all through sheer intelligence and relentless ambition. What he left out of those interviews was the obsession that had fueled that rise. The pathological need for control that had consumed him since childhood. When he'd felt powerless watching his father lose his job, his mother struggle to make ends meet, his family's stability crumble. Leonard had sworn he'd never be at anyone's mercy again. He'd never be the one who could be fired, evicted, dismissed, forgotten. He'd become the one who did the firing, the dismissing, the forgetting. Kraus Tech had started as a legitimate business, wearable biometric devices that tracked heart rate, sleep patterns, physical activity. Performance optimization for athletes, executives, anyone seeking a competitive edge. The devices were sleek, expensive, effective, and they collected an extraordinary amount of data. Data Leonard had learned to weaponize. The military contracts came first. Devices that could monitor soldiers' stress levels in real time, predict when they were approaching psychological breaking points, deliver targeted interventions through haptic feedback and neural stimulation. Publicly, it was about supporting troop mental health. Privately, it was about behavior modification, using biometric data to condition compliance, suppress dissent, engineer obedience. Then came the police departments, the corporate clients, the private security firms, all of them hungry for devices that could monitor their people, predict their behavior, control them through feedback loops so subtle the wearers barely noticed. Heart rate spiking during an interaction with a supervisor? The device delivers a calming pulse. Stress hormones indicating potential insubordination? The system flags the employee for wellness intervention. It was surveillance dressed up as wellness, control masquerading as care, and it had made Leonard obscenely rich. The mansion was his showcase, the physical embodiment of his philosophy, a 3-story monument to integrated smart home technology where every element, every door, light, lock, and camera was connected to a central AI system he'd named Sentinel. The system was breathtaking in its complexity. Facial recognition cameras tracked every person who entered the property, building behavioral profiles, predicting movement patterns. Voice-activated controls responded to Leonard's commands and his alone, learning the subtle variations in his tone that indicated mood, urgency, authority. Biometric locks on every door read fingerprints, retinal patterns, heart rhythms, granting or denying access based on algorithms Leonard had personally designed. LED mood lighting shifted based on real-time analysis of stress hormones detected by sensors embedded in the air filtration system. The entire estate was a living organism, and Leonard was its brain. Or so he believed. The kennel wing was Sentinel's crown jewel, a glass-walled facility that stretched along the mansion's east side, climate-controlled and filled with 8 imported guard dogs worth $50,000 each. Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, trained by former military contractors using precision behavioral conditioning protocols that had cost Leonard another $200,000. Every kennel was equipped with electronic locks controlled by Sentinel. Auto-feeders dispensed meals on algorithmically optimized schedules. Motion sensors tracked the dog's activity levels. Thermal cameras monitored their body temperatures. Even the lighting adjusted based on circadian rhythm research designed to maximize alertness and obedience. The future of animal training, Leonard told guests during tours, running his hand along the glass wall as the dogs watched him with mechanical focus. No punishment, no crude dominance displays, just data-driven conditioning that produces perfect, predictable behavior. These animals respond to my voice commands with 99.7% accuracy. What he didn't tell guests, what only Amira had discovered, was that the kennel wing wasn't just for dogs. Behind the visible kennels, hidden by cleverly designed false walls that appeared to be maintenance closets, were soundproof holding cells equipped with restraints, medical equipment for stands, and biometric monitoring stations identical to the ones Leonard's military clients used in interrogation facilities. The same thermal cameras that tracked his dogs also tracked human subjects. The same motion sensors. The same algorithmic feeding schedules designed to induce compliance through controlled deprivation. Leonard had literally built a laboratory for training people the same way he trained animals. And Sentinel managed it all, recording every data point, every behavioral response, every successful modification for his private research database. But systems, no matter how sophisticated, were only as secure as their weakest point. And Sentinel's weakness was Marco Reyes, a 28-year-old IT contractor who maintained the network for $35 an hour and rarely got the recognition he deserved. Amira had befriended Marco during her second week as Leonard's maid. She'd noticed him working in the server room, looking tired and frustrated, and had brought him coffee. Just a small kindness. You look like you could use this, but it had opened a door. Over the following months, she'd made a point of checking in with Marco during his maintenance visits. More coffee. Sympathetic listening when he complained about Leonard's impossible demands and condescending treatment. Casual questions about his work that made him feel valued, seen. In a house where staff were supposed to be invisible, Marco had started talking. Not because he was disloyal, but because Amira was the only person in the mansion who treated him like a human being. He'd explained how Sentinel worked, the network architecture, the central server clusters, the redundant safety protocols. He'd shown her the admin interface on his tablet, proud of his work, eager to demonstrate his expertise to someone who actually listened. The whole kennel wing runs on a unified system, he told her one afternoon over coffee in the kitchen. All the electronic locks share a common RFID frequency for efficiency. Makes maintenance easier. One master override can access everything if there's an emergency. That sounds complicated, Amira had said, her voice carefully casual. What happens if the system fails? Built-in protocols, Marco had replied. If the AI detects a security breach, unauthorized access, system tampering, that kind of thing, it activates containment mode. Automatically locks down the affected area, seals exits, switches to emergency lighting. Keeps threats isolated until security can respond. That's brilliant, Amira had said, filing away every word. You must be really good at this. Marco had smiled, grateful for the recognition. And 3 weeks ago, during a routine system update, he'd made a mistake. He'd left his equipment bag unattended in the kennel wing for 15 minutes while he checked a malfunctioning camera in the main hall. Amira had seized the opportunity. She'd slipped into the kennel wing, opened Marco's bag, and found the master RFID fob, a small plastic device about the size of a keycard, programmed with override codes for every lock in the system. She'd pocketed it, closed the bag, and disappeared before Marco returned. He'd never noticed it was missing. He had backups. Now, 6 months of patient preparation were about to pay off. Amira sat in the cage, her hands gripping the cold steel bars, her face a mask of defeated humiliation for the cameras. But inside, she was calm, focused, every nerve firing with precision. Leonard stood just outside the cage door, his white Tom Ford suit catching the LED lighting, his smile sharp and victorious as he addressed his guests. "Let this be a lesson," he announced, his voice carrying across the kennel wing and into the main hall where overflow guests watched on projection screens. "In my house, in my company, in my world, loyalty is rewarded. Betrayal is punished." Applause. Champagne glasses raised in agreement. Phones recording from dozens of angles, already uploading to social media with hashtags like #KrausGala and #InnovationNight. Amira's hand slid to the hem of her uniform, fingers finding the small, hard shape of the RFID fob she'd sewn into the fabric. She palmed it carefully, keeping her movements minimal, her face blank. A venture capitalist near the front called out, "How long are you keeping her in there, Leonard?" "As long as necessary," Leonard replied, his tone playful, cruel. "Until she remembers her place. Until everyone watching remembers what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." More laughter. More phones. A senator in a $5,000 suit raised his glass. To consequences. Leonard turned back to Amira, leaning close to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "You thought you were clever. You thought you could expose me. But look where your cleverness got you. Caged like an animal while the world watches and does nothing. That's the lesson, Amira. Power isn't about who's right. It's about who's in control." Amira met his eyes. Her thumb found the activation button on the RFID fob. "You're right, Leonard," she said softly. "It is about control." She pressed the button once. Nothing visible happened. No sound. No flashing lights. Just a tiny electronic signal pulsing out from the fob, broadcasting the master override code on the frequency Marco had mentioned. But deep in the mansion's walls, in the server room that controlled Sentinel, that signal hit the network like a stone through glass. Maintenance override detected. Several electronic locks in the kennel wing received the command simultaneously, disengage. The lock on Amira's cage. The locks on storage closets. And the locks on all 8 dog kennels at the far end of the facility. Sentinel's AI, programmed to interpret unauthorized overrides as security breaches, made an instant decision. Containment mode activated. Throughout the kennel wing, steel shutters began lowering over exits with hydraulic hisses. Corridor doors connecting to the main mansion auto-locked with heavy clangs that echoed off glass walls. Emergency lighting kicked in, pulsing red LEDs that bathed everything in the color of warning, of danger, of systems failing. The guests' applause faltered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Is this part of the show?" another guest called out, uncertain whether to be entertained or alarmed. Leonard's face shifted from triumph to irritation. He pulled out his wrist console, a Kraus prototype device he wore everywhere, programmed with master admin access to every system in the mansion. He tapped the screen, expecting to see routine diagnostic data. Instead, error messages flooded the display. Admin access restricted. Maintenance override in progress. Containment protocol engaged. What the hell? Leonard muttered, tapping frantically, trying to cancel the lockdown. Nothing responded. The system had isolated itself, following protocols he designed to prevent tampering during security events. At the far end of the kennel wing, 8 kennel doors unlocked simultaneously with a series of electronic clicks. The dogs, Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds trained to respond to calm, controlled environments and specific voice commands, raised their heads as their kennel doors swung open. They'd been conditioned in quiet, sterile settings with predictable routines. But now they were confronted with pulsing red emergency lights, blaring alarms, shouting humans, and steel shutters slamming down like the world was ending. Nothing in their precision training had prepared them for this sensory chaos. The dogs began to bark, sharp, confused, agitated sounds that bounced off glass walls and filled the kennel wing with primal noise. Leonard spun toward the sound, his face draining of color as he saw his $400,000 protection dogs emerging from their kennels, no longer moving with mechanical obedience, but with the uncertain, anxious energy of animals in distress. One of the women near the cage screamed. Guests began backing away, pressing against walls, clustering together like prey. And in the cage that was supposed to hold her powerless and humiliated, Amira smiled. The lights flickered. Emergency protocols cycled through Sentinel's damaged network. The dog's barking grew louder, echoing through steel and glass. Leonard's hands shook as he tried again to override the system, his perfect control crumbling into chaos around him. And Amira whispered, too softly for anyone but herself to hear, "Welcome to my house, Leonard." The mansion erupted into chaos in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Containment mode activated. Sentinel's automated voice announced through speakers embedded in every wall, calm and merciless. Security breach detected. Isolating compromised area. Steel shutters slammed down over exits throughout the kennel wing with deafening hydraulic hisses. Emergency barriers designed to seal off threats, dropping from ceiling recesses like guillotine blades made of reinforced metal. The sound was apocalyptic. Bang, bang, bang. Each shutter hit the marble floor with enough force to shake the glass walls, cutting off escape routes one by one. Within seconds, Leonard, Amira, and approximately 15 guests, the ones who'd crowded closest to watch her humiliation, were trapped inside the kennel wing, cut off from the main mansion, sealed in with the dogs and the cages and the secrets Leonard had spent years hiding. Corridor doors connecting to other sections of the estate auto-locked with heavy mechanical clangs, electromagnetic bolts sliding into place with the finality of prison cells. Emergency protocols that Leonard himself had designed, protocols meant to protect him from external threats, were now caging him inside his own nightmare. Red emergency lights pulsed throughout the space, bathing everything in the color of warnings ignored and systems failing. The strobing effect was disorienting, turning familiar surroundings into something alien and hostile. Shadows lurched. Faces appeared and disappeared. The glass walls seemed to close in. "What's happening?" A woman screamed, her champagne glass slipping from her hand and shattering on marble. "Is the system malfunctioning?" Someone else shouted over the blaring alarms. Leonard's face had gone from triumphant to pale in seconds. He yanked up his left wrist, where the Kraus Tech prototype console gleamed, a sleek biometric device he wore everywhere, programmed with master admin access to every system in the estate. His lifeline, his control panel, his guarantee that he always had the final word. He tapped frantically at the touchscreen, swiping through menus, entering override codes. Error messages flashed across the display in angry red text. Admin access restricted. Maintenance override in progress. Containment protocol engaged. Manual cancellation unavailable during active breach. "No, no, no," Leonard hissed, his fingers moving faster, trying backdoor commands, emergency resets, anything that would give him back control. Nothing responded. The system he'd built, the AI he'd trained, the network he'd designed to be impenetrable, all of it was locked against him, following protocols he'd personally coded to prevent tampering during security events. He'd made Sentinel too good, too autonomous, and now it wouldn't listen to its creator. "Garrett," Leonard shouted, spinning toward his head of security, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with military short hair and the cold, assessing eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years as a private military contractor before Leonard had hired him for $250,000 a year to manage his personal security team. Garrett was already moving toward the nearest door panel, flanked by two other guards in dark suits, their expressions grim and professional. They understood the problem immediately: electronic locks controlled by a hostile system, emergency protocols that had turned Leonard's fortress into a trap. Garrett pulled a small toolkit from his jacket and opened the panel beside the main corridor door, exposing wiring and circuit boards. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, trying to bypass the electromagnetic locks, manually override the power supply. Nothing happened. The circuits were isolated, powered by backup batteries, programmed to ignore manual interference during containment mode. "Sir," Garrett said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "the system's in full lockdown. I can't override it from here. I need to access the central server room, but that's on the other side of the shutters," Leonard finished, his voice strangled. The other two guards tried different door panels, different shutters, looking for a weakness in the network. They found none. Leonard had spent millions making sure Sentinel was flawless, unhackable, impossible to compromise. It had never occurred to him that the system might be turned against him by someone on the inside. Meanwhile, in the guest hall beyond the sealed kennel wing, something else was happening, something that made the lockdown look like a minor inconvenience. The massive projection screens that had been displaying glossy Kraustech promotional videos, sleek footage of athletes wearing biometric devices, soldiers performing flawlessly in simulated combat, executives making optimized decisions in boardrooms, suddenly switched to something very different. Static flickered across the screens for half a second. Then raw, unedited footage appeared. Trembling men and women in dog cages. Not the gleaming show kennels Leonard displayed to guests, but the hidden cells, soundproof rooms with concrete walls and steel bars. People in hospital gowns, their faces gaunt and terrified, their wrists restrained. For lines running into their arms. Electrodes attached to their temples, connected to monitoring equipment covered in Kraustech logos. Guards in black uniforms watching through observation windows, taking notes on tablets, discussing subject compliance levels and stress threshold testing. A man sobbing, begging to be released, saying he'd signed up for job training. Not this, not whatever this was. A woman strapped to a chair, electrodes on her head, while a technician adjusted settings on a biometric device. Her body jerking as pulses of feedback conditioning flooded her nervous system. The guests in the main hall, the ones who hadn't been trapped in the kennel wing, gasped audibly. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-word. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Then the audio kicked in, recordings of Leonard's voice on phone calls, discussing his test subjects with the casual detachment of a scientist discussing lab rats. "The homeless population is ideal. No families asking questions, no employment records, easy to isolate. We can push the stress conditioning much further than with military volunteers." Subject 47 became non-compliant after the third conditioning cycle. Terminate the trial and transfer him to disposal protocols. FDA approval will take years and cost millions. We bypass that entirely by using expendable test groups for the initial phase trials. By the time we go public, the technology will be perfected. More footage appeared, contracts displayed on screen, legal documents written in deliberately dense language that obscured what people were actually agreeing to. Vulnerable individuals, homeless veterans, undocumented immigrants, recovering addicts desperate for help, signing away their rights in exchange for $500 and 3 meals a day. Many of the signatures were shaky, barely legible, clearly written by people with limited education who had no idea they were consenting to experimental human trials. Phones throughout the guest hall began buzzing simultaneously, a cascade of notifications as the footage automatically uploaded to social media platforms, news organizations, regulatory agencies. Amira's timed script, triggered the moment Sentinel entered containment mode, was flooding the internet with evidence. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, encrypted file-sharing networks, investigative journalism databases, the FBI's human trafficking tip line, state medical boards, congressional oversight committees. Hashtag Kraus cages began trending within minutes, accompanied by screen-captured footage and horrified commentary. Billionaire tech CEO caught running illegal human experiments. Kraus tech exposed. Homeless people used as test subjects. This is what billionaires do when they think no one's watching. In the guest hall, a venture capitalist named Helen Marsh, a 43-year-old investor who'd put $5 million into Kraus Tech's Series C funding round, pulled out her phone and started live streaming, her face a mix of shock and outrage. Her voice shook as she addressed her 200,000 followers. Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm at Leonard Kraus's Innovation Gala, and this footage is playing on the screens. People in cages. Human experimentation. Leonard, what is this? Is this real? Her live stream was picked up immediately, shared thousands of times, dissected by commentators and journalists in real time. Within 5 minutes, major news networks were calling their contacts at Kraus Tech, demanding statements. Back in the sealed kennel wing, Leonard heard the commotion through the steel shutters, the gasps, the shouting, the phones ringing. He couldn't see the screens, but he could hear his own voice echoing through the mansion's speaker system, discussing test subjects and disposal protocols. His face drained of all remaining color. His hands trembled. He spun toward Amira's cage, stumbling across marble made slippery with spilled champagne, and grabbed the bars with both hands. What did you do? His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through his usual control. What did you do? Amira sat calmly behind the bars, her hands folded in her lap, her face serene despite the bruises forming on her knees and wrists. She met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd spent 6 months planning this exact moment. I gave them the truth, she said quietly. You bitch, Leonard snarled, yanking at the cage door, trying to pull it open manually. His fingers scrabbled at the electronic lock, searching for a manual release, a weakness, anything. The door didn't budge. Still electronically sealed. Still controlled by the system he'd lost access to. You've destroyed me, he hissed, his voice rising to a near scream. Do you have any idea what you've done? My company, my reputation, my life. Your life? Amira's voice cut through his panic like a blade. You took my brother's life. You took hundreds of people's lives and treated them like lab rats. You caged human beings and called it science. You murdered people who trusted you. Her voice stayed level, but fury burned beneath it like molten steel. I didn't destroy you, Leonard. I just made sure the world could see what you really are. Leonard's wrist console buzzed with notifications, messages from his board of directors, his PR team, his lawyers, all demanding to know what was happening, what the footage meant, whether it was real. His phone was exploding with calls. His carefully constructed empire was collapsing in real time. He turned to Garrett, desperation replacing his usual command. Get her out of that cage. Break the lock. I don't care how. Just get her out so I can. So you can what? Amira interrupted, her voice cold. Kill me like you killed Jamal? Dispose of me off the coast. Waited, no trace. She quoted his own words back to him, words she'd found on his private recordings. Leonard's face twisted with rage and fear. Garrett now. Garrett moved toward the cage, pulling a pry bar from his toolkit, but before he could reach it, a new sound filled the kennel wing, a sound that made everyone freeze. Electronic buzzing. Clicks. Locks disengaging. At the far end of the wing, all 8 dog kennels that had remained closed suddenly unlocked at once, their doors swinging open in perfect synchronization. The dogs, 8 Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds worth $50,000 each, trained by military contractors to be perfect protection animals, emerged from their kennels into a nightmare of pulsing red lights, blaring alarms, shouting humans, and steel barriers slamming shut. They'd been conditioned in quiet, controlled environments with predictable routines and calm handlers. This was sensory chaos that shattered every pattern they'd been trained to follow. The dogs' ears flattened. Their bodies went rigid with confusion and stress. One began barking, a sharp, aggressive sound born of fear rather than training. Another joined in. Then all 8 were barking, pacing, circling, their movements agitated and unpredictable. The guests trapped in the kennel wing screamed and pressed themselves against the glass walls, as far from the animals as possible. Leonard's face went from pale to gray. His $400,000 investment in elite protection dogs had just become another weapon turned against him. Garrett and his guards positioned themselves between the dogs and the guests, hands on their concealed weapons, but they knew the truth. In this confined space, with animals this large and this well-trained in combat techniques, shooting them would only cause more chaos and potential injury to bystanders. And in the cage Leonard had used to humiliate her, to break her, to show the world she was powerless, Amira smiled. She still held the RFID fob hidden in her palm. She had one more command to send, one more system to hijack. Leonard turned back to her, his eyes wild, his perfect composure completely shattered. The billionaire who'd built an empire on control was watching that control evaporate in real time, broadcast to millions of people, recorded from dozens of angles, going viral as his life imploded. "Please," he whispered, the word foreign and desperate in his mouth. "Please, stop this. I'll give you anything. Anything." Amira looked at him through the bars. This man who'd killed her brother, who'd destroyed hundreds of lives, who'd caged her like an animal in front of a mansion full of witnesses, and said one word. "No." Her thumb pressed the fob's activation button one more time. And the real show began. 8 Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds surged out of their kennels into chaos. These weren't ordinary protection dogs. They were elite animals, carefully bred and imported from European bloodlines, each one costing Leonard over $50,000 before training. They'd spent months being conditioned by former military contractors in quiet, controlled environments, pristine facilities with consistent lighting, predictable schedules, calm handlers who used precise verbal cues and hand signals. Every element of their training had been designed to produce animals that responded with mechanical perfection to specific commands. But nothing in their conditioning had prepared them for this. Pulsing red emergency lights strobed across the kennel wing, bathing everything in disorienting flashes that turned shadows into threats. Alarms blared through speakers at frequencies that hurt sensitive canine ears. Steel shutters slammed against marble with percussive bangs that echoed off glass walls. Humans screamed and shouted and ran in panic patterns. The air smelled wrong, sweat and fear and spilled champagne, mixing with the metallic scent of overheated electronics. It was sensory overload. Every stimulus contradicted their training. The dogs emerged from their kennels with their ears flattened, bodies rigid, movements jerky and uncertain. Their training had taught them to be calm in combat scenarios, controlled in high-stress situations. But those scenarios had always been predictable, structured, quiet rooms with specific targets and clear commands from handlers they trusted. This was pandemonium, and Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, despite being among the most trainable breeds in the world, were still animals. When their conditioning broke down, instinct took over. "Sit," Leonard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Heel. Down." The dogs turned toward his voice, years of training making them want to obey. But the commands weren't landing cleanly. Leonard's voice was wrong, too high, too panicked, too different from the calm authority of their trainers. And the environment was overwhelming their ability to focus. One dog, a massive German shepherd named Thor, sat uncertainly for 3 seconds, then stood again, pacing in a tight circle as another alarm pulse made him flinch. A Belgian Malinois named Athena responded to down by dropping into a crouch, but her eyes were locked on the moving guests, her prey drive activated by their frantic movements. The other 6 dogs simply didn't respond at all. They circled each other, barking sharp warning sounds, snapping when another dog got too close to their personal space. Their carefully maintained pack hierarchy was dissolving into territorial anxiety. Belgian Malinois were bred to be herding dogs with high energy and intelligence. They needed jobs, structure, mental stimulation. Without it, they became destructive and unruly, displaying behavioral problems that even experienced trainers struggled to control. And German Shepherds, while slightly more stable, were protective animals whose instinct under stress was to guard, to control, to neutralize threats. The guests trapped in the kennel wing screamed and pressed themselves against the glass walls, as far from the animals as possible. One woman in a designer gown fainted, collapsing against a man in a tuxedo who tried to hold her upright while keeping his eyes on the circling dogs. Garrett, Leonard's head of security, moved forward with his hands raised, trying to project the calm authority the dogs had been trained to respond to. "Easy," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Easy, Thor. Athena. Down." For a moment, it seemed like it might work. Thor's ears perked forward. Athena's pacing slowed. Then one of the other Belgian Malinois, a younger male named Odin, lunged at Garrett, not in a full attack, but in a dominance display, testing whether this human was actually in control or just another panicking animal. Odin's teeth caught Garrett's suit sleeve, tearing through expensive fabric and drawing a thin line of blood across his forearm. Garrett jerked back, hand moving instinctively toward the concealed weapon at his hip, but he stopped himself. Shooting in this enclosed space with panicked civilians would be catastrophic. Instead, he backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact, trying to avoid triggering a full-scale attack. The dogs sensed the shift in power, sensed that the humans were afraid, that no one was truly in control. They began pacing more aggressively, their barking intensifying, their movements becoming predatory rather than confused. Leonard backed away from Amira's cage, his face sheet white, his hands shaking. His expensive white Tom Ford suit was torn at the shoulder where he'd stumbled against a steel shutter. Sweat soaked through his shirt, dark patches spreading under his arms and across his chest. His perfect image, the billionaire tech genius, the man who controlled everything, was disintegrating as thoroughly as his security system. Amira watched through the bars, calculating her next move with the precision of someone who'd spent 6 months planning for every contingency. The dogs were loose. The system was in lockdown. The footage was spreading globally. But she wasn't finished. She had one more revelation to deliver, one more secret to expose. Her fingers moved to her sleeve, the left one, where weeks ago she'd carefully sewn a tiny Bluetooth microphone into the fabric, linked to a backup smartphone she'd hidden in the air vent above the kennel wing. A phone that had been recording everything, uploading everything to her encrypted servers, waiting for this exact moment. She whispered into the hidden mic, her voice barely audible over the barking and alarms. "Execute final protocol. Audio override. Broadcast all files." 5 seconds later, the mansion's entire speaker system, every room, every corridor, every outdoor terrace, overrode whatever was playing and switched to a new audio source. Leonard's private voice memos, the ones he recorded for himself, thinking they were secure, encrypted, safely stored on his personal devices that Amira had accessed months ago through Marco's stolen admin credentials. His voice, cold and clinical, echoed through the mansion and broadcast live through Helen Marsh's still-streaming phone to her 200,000 followers. Subject 47 became non-compliant during the 3rd conditioning cycle. Transfer him off books. No records. Use the standard disposal protocol. Gasps from the guests in the main hall. Horror spreading across faces. Phones recording every word. Another memo, recorded just 3 months ago. "We can't afford liability with the Phase 2 trials. If the test subjects don't sign the expanded NDAs, make sure they can't talk. Permanently." Garrett knows the protocols. Garrett, standing in the kennel wing with blood running down his arm and dogs circling his position, went rigid. Every eye turned toward him. He'd been following orders. Just following orders. But now the world knew. A 3rd memo, this one recorded with traffic noise in the background, Leonard speaking from his car. "The Bello situation is getting complicated. Jamal Bello keeps asking questions, trying to contact his sister. He's seen too much of the holding cells. Handle it quietly. Phase him out of the program. Full disposal." Amira's breath caught. Her brother's name, spoken with the casual detachment of someone discussing trash removal. Another voice on the recording, Garrett's, responded, "Where do you want him, sir?" Leonard, the usual. "Off the coast, past the shipping lanes." Waited. No trace. "Make it look like he wandered off from the facility and drowned accidentally. The staff will back up the story." Silence in the kennel wing. Even the dogs seemed to pause, sensing the shift in emotional energy. Then phones throughout the mansion and around the world exploded with notifications. The audio was being live-streamed to hundreds of thousands of viewers. Screen captured, shared, reported to law enforcement in real time. Hashtag Kraus murders began trending alongside hashtag Kraus cages. News networks interrupted their regular programming. FBI field offices received thousands of tips simultaneously. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan got an emergency call from a senior prosecutor who'd been watching Helen's live stream. In the kennel wing, Leonard seemed to collapse inward, his entire body sagging as he realized what had just happened. Every secret, every crime, every calculated cruelty he'd committed, thinking he was untouchable, all of it broadcast to the world, recorded from multiple angles, going viral with millions of witnesses. He turned slowly toward Amira's cage, his legs unsteady, his face the color of old concrete. She was the only person who could stop this now. The only one with the access codes, the kill switches, the ability to cancel the uploads and scrub the servers. Leonard stumbled toward the cage, his expensive shoes slipping on marble wet with spilled champagne and dog saliva. One of the Belgian Malinois, Athena, darted toward him, snapping at his ankle, not quite biting but close enough that Leonard felt her breath on his skin. He jerked away, lost his balance, and dropped to his knees in front of the cage. Blood ran from his right hand where another dog, Thor, had nipped his finger during the initial chaos, not hard enough to sever, but enough to crack the bone and tear skin. His snapped finger jutted at an unnatural angle, throbbing with pain he'd been too panicked to notice until now. "Please," Leonard whispered, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. He'd spent 52 years never having to beg for anything, never being at anyone's mercy, never powerless. His voice cracked, tears forming in his eyes, not tears of remorse, but tears of desperation, of watching his empire burn in real time. "Please, Amira. I'll give you anything. Money, millions, billions eventually. A foundation in your name. Jamal's name. I'll fund whatever causes you want." Stop," Amira said quietly, her voice cutting through his rambling. Leonard fell silent, looking up at her through the bars that separated them. The billionaire on his knees. The maid looking down at him from inside the cage he'd used to humiliate her. "Say it," Amira commanded, her voice steady and cold. "Say what you did. Say it loud enough for them to hear." She gestured to the guests, to the phones still recording, to the world watching through live streams and social media. "I can't," Leonard started. "Say it." Amira's voice rose to a shout, all the rage and grief of 6 months channeling into 2 words. "Say you murdered my brother. Say you used human beings as test subjects. Say you killed people who tried to escape. Say it." Leonard's hands shook. His injured finger throbbed. The dogs circled closer, sensing weakness. Phones recorded from a dozen angles. Helen's live stream had over 1 million viewers now, all of them waiting, watching this moment of reckoning. And Leonard Kraus, the man who'd built a $4.8 billion empire on control and surveillance and behavior modification, broke. His voice came out shaking, tearful, barely audible at first. I use people. Vulnerable people. People no one would miss." "Louder," Amira demanded. Leonard's voice rose, cracking with emotion. "I tested experimental devices on homeless people, undocumented immigrants, addicts, anyone desperate enough to sign contracts they didn't understand. I detained them against their will. I conditioned them using behavior modification protocols. I treated human beings like lab animals." Gasps. Sobs. Someone vomiting in the main hall. "And when they tried to escape?" Amira pressed. Leonard's face crumpled. "I had them killed. Disposed of. Made to disappear so they couldn't expose what I was doing. Off the coast. Waited. No bodies. No evidence." His voice was barely more than a whisper now, but the microphones caught every word. "Say his name," Amira demanded, her voice breaking for the first time. Leonard looked up at her, saw the tears streaming down her face, and understood that this was the moment she'd been waiting for. The confession that would haunt him forever. "Jamal Bello," Leonard said, his voice shaking. "He was one of the test subjects. He started asking questions, trying to contact you, threatening to expose the program. I ordered him killed. Garrett arranged it. We dumped his body off the coast. He's gone. I murdered him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Captured on dozens of phones. Broadcast to over 1 million viewers. Recorded from multiple angles with perfect audio. A full, tearful, on-camera confession to human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, illegal human experimentation, and murder. Leonard slumped forward, his forehead nearly touching the bars of the cage, broken and defeated. And Amira, sitting behind those bars with tears streaming down her face and her brother's name finally vindicated, whispered, "That's for Jamal. And everyone else you destroyed." Outside the mansion, police sirens wailed. Someone had called 911 the moment the footage started playing. Federal investigators were already mobilizing. News helicopters circled overhead. Leonard Kraus's empire was over. His life was over. And the entire world had watched him fall. The dogs continued to circle, barking into the chaos, as the red emergency lights pulsed and the steel shutters held everyone trapped in the moment of Leonard's complete destruction. Leonard Kraus knelt on cold marble in front of the cage, surrounded by agitated dogs, trapped guests, and hundreds of live-streaming phones, and began to confess to the world. His white Tom Ford suit was torn and stained. Blood dripped from his snapped finger, pooling on the floor beneath him. Sweat soaked through his shirt, plastering it to his chest. His hair, always perfectly styled, hung in disheveled strands across his forehead. The billionaire who'd built an empire on control looked like a man whose entire existence was collapsing in real time. And it was. Every word he spoke was being captured from dozens of angles. Phones held by terrified guests. Helen Marsh's live stream with over 1.5 million viewers now. Security cameras that Amira had rerouted to upload directly to news organizations and federal investigators. His voice came out shaking, raw with desperation. I use people. Vulnerable people. Homeless. Undocumented. Addicts. People no one would miss. The guests trapped in the kennel wing stood frozen against the glass walls, their faces horrified. One woman was openly sobbing. A tech investor who'd put $10 million into Kraus Tech stared at Leonard like he was seeing him for the first time. Leonard's voice cracked as he continued. I tested biometric devices on them without proper consent, without ethical oversight, without treating them like human beings. The words hung in the air, damning and irrevocable. In the main hall beyond the steel shutters, guests who'd been celebrating moments ago stood in stunned silence, watching the footage play on projection screens. Some were already calling lawyers. Others were deleting social media posts where they'd praised Leonard's genius. I buried complaints, Leonard continued, the confession pouring out of him now like poison from a wound. Paid off officials, medical board investigators, city inspectors, anyone who got too close to discovering what I was doing. I made people disappear when they threatened to talk, when they threatened to expose the trials. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold them together. Blood from his injured fingers streaked across his palms. Behind him, the 8 dogs continued to pace and circle, Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds whose precision training had dissolved into anxious, unpredictable behavior. Thor growled low in his throat. Athena snapped at Odin when he got too close. The animals sensed the chaos, the breakdown of order, and it made them dangerous. Garrett stood near the sealed corridor doors, his torn sleeve exposing the bite wound on his forearm, his face carefully neutral despite knowing that his name had been mentioned in Leonard's recorded memos. Despite knowing that he, too, would face consequences for following orders he should have questioned. Amira's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and steady. Say his name. Leonard looked up at her through the bars. This woman he'd tried to humiliate, to break, to cage like an animal. She sat behind steel with tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were hard as diamond, burning with a grief and fury he'd never truly understood. Jamal Bello, Leonard whispered. Louder, Amira demanded. Leonard's voice rose, breaking on the syllables. Jamal Bello. He was one of the test subjects at the Rehabilitation and Renewal Center. He was your brother. He was a good person, trying to rebuild his life, and I used him. Tested behavioral modification protocols on him. Monitored his stress responses, his compliance levels, what happened when he started asking questions. Amira pressed, her voice shaking but relentless. Leonard's face crumpled. The billionaire veneer, the tech genius persona, the carefully constructed image of innovation and progress, all of it disintegrated, leaving only a broken man who'd committed monstrous acts and gotten caught. He saw too much, Leonard said, his voice barely audible over the dog's agitated barking. He saw the holding cells, the other subjects. He understood what we were really doing. He tried to contact you, tried to warn you, tried to escape. And Amira's voice was ice. He didn't survive the trial. The words came out like stones, heavy and final. I had him. I ordered him, disposed of. Gasps echoed through both the kennel wing and the main hall. Helen's livestream chat exploded with comments. Thousands of messages per second, most of them calling for Leonard's arrest, his execution, his complete destruction. News networks were already breaking into programming with breaking. Tech billionaire confesses to murder on livestream. Amira's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady, demanding every detail. Where? Leonard's hands came up to cover his face, but he forced himself to look at her, to face what he'd done. Off the coast, past the shipping lanes. We weighted his body, made sure it wouldn't surface, made sure there'd be no trace, no evidence, no body for you to bury. The last sentence broke Amira visibly. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her hands gripping the bars until her knuckles went white. For 6 months she'd suspected. For 2 years before that she'd searched. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the cold, clinical details of how her brother had been murdered and disposed of like trash, carved something out of her chest that would never heal. I'm sorry, Leonard whispered, the words meaningless and hollow. I'm so sorry. You're not sorry you did it, Amira said, her voice cutting through his false contrition. You're sorry you got caught. Leonard opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Because she was right. Every apology he'd offered had been transactional, begging for mercy, for escape, for a way to minimize the consequences. Not genuine remorse for the lives he'd destroyed. The words echoed through every speaker in the mansion, carried through Helen's live stream to millions of viewers, recorded and archived on dozens of devices. A full confession to human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, illegal human experimentation without informed consent, murder, and conspiracy, all captured with perfect clarity from multiple angles, with Leonard's face visible and his voice unmistakable. The guests in the kennel wing were crying now, some from horror, some from fear, some from the realization that they'd just witnessed a man's complete destruction and their own complicity in celebrating a monster. Amira held the RFID fob in her palm, her thumb resting on the emergency release button. She could end this now, could unlock the cage, let Sentinel restore normal operations, call off the dogs, release the trapped guests. Or she could leave Leonard here, leave him surrounded by the agitated animals, the horrified witnesses, the live streaming phones documenting his breakdown. She could let the dogs, the media, the collapsing system destroy him completely. Let him become a viral spectacle, a cautionary tale, a man who'd caged others and died in a cage of his own making. Leonard seemed to sense her hesitation. Please, he begged, his voice breaking on the word. Please, Amira. Let me out. I'll turn myself in. I'll cooperate with investigators. I'll testify against everyone who helped me. Garrett, the guards, the doctors, the administrators. I'll plead guilty to everything. Just let me out. So you can hire lawyers? Amira's voice was bitter. So you can make bail with your billions? So you can flee to a country without extradition? No, I won't run. I swear I won't. Your promises mean nothing, Amira interrupted. She stared at him for a long, silent moment. This man who'd murdered her brother. This man who'd treated hundreds of vulnerable people like laboratory animals, violating every ethical principle of informed consent and human dignity. This man who'd built an empire on surveillance and control and behavior modification, turning human beings into data points to be optimized and discarded. She thought of Jamal, his laugh, his determination to rebuild his life, his final desperate phone call begging her to save him. She thought of Marcus, the homeless veteran who'd disappeared. She thought of all the unnamed, faceless people Leonard had used and disposed of, people whose families would never know what happened to them. And she thought of justice. Real justice. Not a quick death in a kennel. Not a viral video of a man being mauled by dogs while the world watched. Not revenge that would make her as much of a monster as Leonard. She whispered, her voice steady and final. You don't get to die a martyr. You don't get to become a viral tragedy that people forget in a week. You're going to face every single one of them in court. Every. The federal courtroom in Manhattan's Southern District was packed beyond capacity. Survivors in the gallery holding photos of disappeared loved ones. Journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder in the press section. Federal prosecutors surrounded by towers of evidence boxes. and a lone figure in an orange prison jumpsuit sitting at the defendant's table with his head bowed. Leonard Kraus looked nothing like the billionaire who'd stood in a white Tom Ford suit, commanding a mansion full of tech elites while he caged a woman for entertainment. His hair had gone almost entirely gray in 6 months. Stress, poor nutrition, and the crushing weight of what awaited him had aged him decades. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin that hadn't seen sunlight since his arrest. His hands, once adorned with a $200,000 watch and a Kraus Tech prototype console, were now cuffed in standard-issue restraints. He looked small, powerless, broken. The charges read by the prosecution were staggering in scope: unlawful imprisonment, human trafficking, aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, involuntary servitude, illegal human experimentation, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, conspiracy to commit murder, and 17 counts of manslaughter, one for each victim whose body had been recovered off the coast or whose death could be definitively linked to his trials. The prosecution had spent months building an airtight case from the evidence Amira had gathered and the on-camera confession Leonard had made to millions of witnesses. Amira Bello took the stand on day 3 of the trial, wearing a navy suit that made her look professional and composed despite the trauma she carried. Her voice was calm as she walked the jury through 6 months of undercover work: the files she'd photographed, the footage she'd copied, the audio recordings she'd preserved, the systematic documentation of Leonard's crimes. "I watched him treat human beings like laboratory animals," she testified, her eyes never leaving the jury. "I documented 347 individual cases of people who were detained against their will, experimented on without informed consent, conditioned using behavioral modification techniques that violated every ethical principle of medical research." She presented the evidence methodically: contracts designed to deceive vulnerable people, medical records showing unauthorized biometric implants, video footage of people screaming to be released, audio of Leonard discussing expendable test groups and disposal protocols. When Leonard's defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence out of revenge, Amira simply gestured to the hundreds of hours of footage, the thousands of documents, the on-camera confession that had been viewed over 50 million times. "I didn't need to fabricate anything," she said quietly. "He documented his own crimes. I just made sure the world could see them." Over the following weeks, survivors testified: men and women who'd been detained in Leonard's facilities, who'd had devices implanted in their bodies without understanding what they were consenting to, who'd been threatened and terrorized when they tried to leave. A homeless veteran named Marcus, the same one Amira had tried to help years ago, testified that he'd been held for 8 months, subjected to stress conditioning trials, where electrodes delivered painful pulses whenever his heart rate or stress hormones spiked beyond acceptable parameters. He'd lost 40 pounds. He still had nightmares. A woman named Rosa testified through tears about being promised job training and housing, only to find herself locked in a soundproof cell with a biometric monitor strapped to her wrist that tracked her every physiological response. When she tried to remove it, guards had restrained her and increased the conditioning intensity. A man named David testified about watching his cellmate, a recovering addict named Jamal Bello, being dragged out of the facility after he'd tried to contact his sister. "They said he was being transferred to a medical unit," David said, his voice shaking. "I never saw him again. None of us did. We all knew what transferred really meant." Families of the disappeared filled the gallery, holding photos of sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, parents who trusted Leonard's foundation and vanished into his system. They listened to testimony about weighted bodies dumped offshore, about disposal protocols and expendable populations, about the callous efficiency with which Leonard had made people disappear. The prosecution presented evidence of 347 documented cases of abuse, people who'd been detained, experimented on, threatened, or killed. And those were only the cases they could prove. Investigators believed the true number was much higher, but many victims had been chosen specifically because they had no families to report them missing, no documentation to prove they'd existed. While the trial proceeded, Leonard's empire crumbled in spectacular fashion. Kraus Tech stock collapsed from $847 per share to $3.12 in a matter of weeks, wiping out billions in shareholder value. Government contracts were canceled. The the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, police departments across the country all terminated agreements for biometric devices, demanding refunds and launching their own investigations into whether they'd unknowingly deployed technology developed through illegal human experimentation. The FDA opened an investigation into every device Kraus Tech had ever certified, questioning whether the approval process had been corrupted by Leonard's wealth and influence. Leonard's wife, a socialite named Catherine who'd spent 20 years enjoying his wealth without asking where it came from, filed for divorce 3 weeks after his arrest, claiming she'd had no knowledge of his activities. She liquidated every joint asset she could access and donated $15 million to victims' funds in what her lawyer called an act of conscience and what everyone else recognized as damage control. His business partners turned state's evidence one by one, providing testimony about meetings where Leonard had discussed the efficiency of using vulnerable populations for testing, about his instructions to pay off regulators, about his explicit orders to handle problems permanently. Garrett, the head of security who'd carried out Leonard's disposal orders, took a plea deal in exchange for testimony. 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. He described in clinical detail how 12 people had been killed and their bodies dumped at sea. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution played the confession one more time. Leonard on his knees in his mansion, blood running from his injured hand, surrounded by agitated dogs and live-streaming phones, admitting to everything. The jury watched in absolute silence. When it was over, they deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. Judge Maria Castellanos, a 58-year-old federal judge known for her careful deliberation and harsh sentencing of white-collar criminals who harmed vulnerable populations, addressed the packed courtroom with controlled fury. "Mr. Kraus," she said, looking directly at Leonard, "you had every advantage in life. Wealth, education, opportunity. You could have used your intelligence and resources to help people. Instead, you chose to treat human beings like property, like test subjects, like animals to be trained, used, and discarded when they were no longer useful to you." She detailed the scope of his crimes, the 347 documented victims, the 17 confirmed deaths, the hundreds of thousands of people who'd unknowingly used biometric devices developed through illegal human experimentation. "You didn't just commit crimes," Judge Castellanos continued. "You built a system of exploitation so comprehensive, so carefully hidden, that it took years for anyone to expose it. You corrupted officials, silenced witnesses, destroyed the lives of anyone who threatened to reveal what you were doing. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even then, your apologies were transactional, begging for mercy while showing none to your victims." Leonard sat motionless, staring at the table. The judge's voice hardened. "This court sentences you to 40 years in federal prison on the human trafficking and manslaughter charges, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Given your age, Mr. Kraus, this is effectively a life sentence. You will die in prison, as you deserve." The gallery erupted, some people sobbing in relief, others cheering, survivors embracing each other. But the judge wasn't finished. She also ordered the seizure of Leonard's assets, his mansion, his investment portfolios, his intellectual property rights to every Kraus Tech patent, his offshore accounts. $2.1 billion would be redirected to a restitution fund for victims and their families, with the remainder funding a new nonprofit dedicated to legal aid, rehabilitation services, and advocacy for trafficking survivors. "Your wealth was built on suffering," Judge Castellanos said. "It will be dismantled and used to heal the damage you caused." Leonard Kraus was led out of the courtroom in chains. He never looked at the gallery, never looked at Amira, just shuffled out with his head down, a broken man facing decades in a 6x8 cell. 8 months after the sentencing, the transformation was complete. The Kraus estate, the hilltop smart mansion where Leonard had caged Amira in front of a mansion full of witnesses, had been converted into the Bello Justice and Recovery Center, a comprehensive facility providing legal aid, trauma counseling, job training, and housing assistance for trafficking survivors. The mansion's gleaming marble and imported sculptures had been replaced with warm, accessible spaces designed for healing rather than intimidation. The voice-activated controls and facial recognition cameras had been dismantled, the biometric locks removed. Sentinel, the AI system that had controlled every element of Leonard's domain, had been completely purged. And the kennel wing, the glass-walled facility where dogs and human beings had been caged and trained, had been gutted and renovated into a bright, open counseling center with therapy rooms, support group spaces, and offices for caseworkers and attorneys. The steel cages had been removed entirely, the soundproof holding cells demolished, every trace of Leonard's torture chamber erased. In the courtyard where Leonard had once displayed his $50,000 protection dogs, a memorial sculpture stood, the old dog cages and holding cell bars, cut apart and welded together by a local artist into an abstract piece representing broken chains and rising phoenixes. A plaque at its base listed the names of the 17 confirmed dead and included a line that read, "For all those whose names we never learned, you are not forgotten." Amira Bello stood in the former kennel wing on a warm afternoon, watching children from the Recovery Center's family housing program play in the therapy garden visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Their laughter echoed through the space where dogs had once barked and people had screamed. She'd been named to the founding board of the Bello Justice Initiative, the nonprofit funded by Leonard's seized assets, alongside survivors, legal advocates, and former prosecutors who understood the systems that had allowed Leonard to operate for so long. They'd helped 89 survivors access legal services in 8 months, funded 34 lawsuits against companies that had knowingly used Leonard's illegally developed technology, placed 127 people in safe housing and job training programs, started legislative campaigns to close the loopholes that had allowed private detention facilities to operate without oversight. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what Leonard had done. But it was something. It was justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real. A television in the common area played the evening news, and Amira caught the anchor's words. Leonard Kraus, the disgraced tech billionaire, once worth $4.8 billion, is now serving his sentence at FCI Coleman in Florida, a medium-security federal prison. Sources say he spends 23 hours a day in a 6x8 cell, has lost over 60 pounds, and has been placed in protective custody after receiving threats from other inmates. His projected release date, assuming he survives, is 2050, when he will be 77 years old. Amira turned away from the screen. She didn't need to watch Leonard's destruction anymore. She'd already seen it. She'd been the architect of it. She pulled a small photo from her pocket. Jamal, smiling at a family barbecue the summer before he disappeared. His arm was around her shoulders. His eyes were bright with hope, with determination, with the belief that he could rebuild his life. "I did it," she whispered to the photo. "I made him pay. I made sure everyone knew what he did to you. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I saved others. I'll keep saving them." She felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, not peace exactly, but a sense that she'd done what she'd set out to do. That Jamal's death hadn't been meaningless. That the system that had killed him was being dismantled, piece by piece, case by case. Behind her, a caseworker called her name. "Amira? The new intake family is here. They're asking for you." Amira tucked the photo back into her pocket, took a deep breath, and turned toward her work. She walked through the bright, open space, past therapy rooms where survivors learned to reclaim their autonomy, past legal offices where attorneys built cases against exploiters, past support groups where people who'd been treated as less than human learned to see themselves as whole again. She walked past the windows where sunlight streamed in, banishing the shadows. And she walked outside into the warm afternoon, where children played and survivors healed, and the world Leonard Kraus had built from cruelty and control was being transformed, day by day, into something that actually served the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. The cage was gone. The dogs were gone. The billionaire was gone. And in their place, hope, fragile and hard-won, but growing stronger every day. What was your favorite moment from Amira's story? Was it when she pressed that button and watched Leonard's empire crumble? When he confessed on his knees? Or the moment justice was finally served? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, I've got another story that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. A woman discovers her husband's secret life, and what she does next will shock you. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.